President and Mrs. Reagan and former President Richard Nixon were among 200 people who gathered to mourn Casey, who died on Wednesday. They were also among those shocked when a bishop chose to criticize Casey during his eulogy.
His conviction about the fundamental moral purpose of American actions, I am sure, made incomprehensible to him the ethical questions raised by me as his bishop. I am equally sure that Bill must have thought the U.S. bishops blind to the potential of a communist threat in this hemisphere as we oppose and continue to oppose the violence wrought in Central America by the support of the Contras.
Also unusual was a memorial speech by former U.S. Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick. After praising Casey, she delivered an attack on communism and praise for U.S. Star Wars research. The mourners then responded with applause. President and Mrs. Reagan left right after the funeral and did not attend the burial. The president did not comment on the unusual service.
The young man who fought to reaffirm his marriage vows in St. Patrick's Cathedral was memorialized
at the age of 74, several months after undergoing surgery for a brain tumor.
Just one day after Gary Hart's withdrawal from the race for the 1988 Democratic
fundamental disagreement on these matters with a man whom I knew and respected.
Casey was heavily involved in the Iran-Contra affair. Retired Air Force Major General Richard Secord has testified he met with Casey 3 times to discuss the secret military resupply operation for the Contras at a time when Congress had prohibited all military aid to the rebels. Former national security officials say the president relied heavily on Casey.
I think Bill Casey was one of the critical advisors and closest advisors to Ronald Reagan on the whole question of Central America, Caribbean, Latin America.
But the president has denied that he ever talked with Casey or any other official about covert military aid to the Contras. Still, former CIA officials don't believe Casey was freelancing.
I think he was doing the president's will. He was trying to carry out the objectives that the president very clearly had.
At the end of the funeral service, former UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, in her remarks, said supporting the freedom fighters had a special priority for Casey, but no more priority than the law. Family members buried William Casey this afternoon. Instead of flowers, they've asked well-wishers to send money to help support the Contras. Robin Lloyd, NBC News, New York.
A spokesman for Senator Gary Hart says that
on Long Island, and for a man whose career as a spy, as an author, financier, and political fundraiser had included many strange twists, his funeral was no different. Jacqueline Adams has our report.
Former CIA Director William Casey's funeral on Long Island today brought together many of his old political friends, from President and Mrs. Reagan to Contra leader Adolfo Calero. What they heard in the eulogy from another of his friends, Bishop John McGahn of Rockville Center, was a ringing condemnation of the policies Casey so enthusiastically supported. The bishop said he was sure Casey never understood the church's opposition to U.S. nuclear policy.
I am equally sure that Bill must have thought the U.S. bishops blind to the potential of a communist threat in this hemisphere as we oppose and continue to oppose the violence wrought in Central America by the support of the Contras.
But another friend, former UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, defended Casey. She called him a fighter, a man willing to take a risk. Upon Casey's death, the president called his old friend a patriot. But privately, White House aides heaved a sigh of relief. The book is now closed, they said, on Casey and all of his secrets in the still unfolding Iran-Contra affair. Jacqueline Adams, CBS News, with the president in New York.
The congressional investigation into the
Casey. President and Mrs. Reagan led a host of dignitaries who attended under tight security. Sheila Cast reports.
Former CIA Director William Casey was buried today with a funeral mass at his Catholic parish, St. Mary's Church, near his home on Long Island. Casey died Wednesday after a struggle with cancer of the central nervous system. Casey was advisor to presidents, a status reflected by the limousine arrivals at his funeral. Most prominent were President and Mrs. Reagan. Sitting with them in the first pew was former President Nixon. News cameras were kept outside. Even at his funeral, Casey did not escape the controversy over the Nicaraguan Contras. Bishop John McGahn said Casey, active in his diocese, clashed over aid to the Nicaraguan rebels.
And I cannot conceal or disguise my fundamental disagreement on these matters with a man whom I knew and respected. Bill must have thought the U.S. bishops blind to the potential of a communist threat in this hemisphere as we oppose and continue to oppose the violence wrought in Central America by the support of the Contras.
But McGahn said Casey was doing what he thought best. And in her eulogy, former UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick sought to answer those who suspect Casey of skirting the law in the Iran-Contra affair.
And supporting Nicaragua's freedom fighters had a special priority for him, no question about it. But they had no more priority than law. Bill Casey was one smart lawyer.
Casey took with him the answers to some questions about the Iran-Contra affair. His family has asked that instead of flowers, donations be made to the William J. Casey Fund for the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. Sheila Cast, ABC News, Roslyn Harbor, Long Island.
After more than 7 years of...
Even in death, former CIA Chief William Casey was buried today, taking with him to the grave key answers to the Iran-Contra scandal.
It was here in Roslyn Harbor, Long Island, that funeral services were held for William Casey, a New York native. Arriving from Kennedy Airport in a speeding motorcade, President Reagan and his wife Nancy, to lead the mourners, among them former President Richard Nixon and former UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick. Legions of police and Secret Service agents fanned out across this sleepy community, suddenly jarred awake by the arrival of America's leadership.
I'm hoping to see President and Mrs. Reagan. I did see President Nixon.
Even in death, Casey was the target of demonstrators. Local clergymen staged a protest near the Catholic Church. They were angry over the Casey family's request that instead of flowers, donations be sent to a special Casey fund for the Nicaraguan freedom fighters, also known as the Contra rebels.
We take more than exception to their request for memorializing this man by donations of money to kill Nicaraguan peasants and children.
But mourners call it support for democracy in Nicaragua. Even Casey's defenders acknowledge the man knew more about the Iran-Contra affair than almost anyone else. Casey collapsed from a brain seizure in December as he was set to testify before Congress on the diversion of money from Iranian arms sales to the Contras.
There was even controversy over the eulogy for Casey today, as Rockville Center Bishop John McGahn said the funeral mass before President Reagan. He criticized Casey's stand on Central America, saying Casey never understood the ethical issues his church embraces.
Traffic flow across the Williamsburg Bridge.
Mrs. Reagan led a host of government officials and dignitaries to the invitation-only funeral. Casey, a key figure in the Iran-Contra scandal, died Wednesday from complications brought on by brain surgery. He was 74. The presiding bishop at today's service spoke fondly of Casey, but disagreed with his position on foreign policy.
Bill must have thought the U.S. bishops blind to the potential of a communist threat in this hemisphere as we oppose and continue to oppose the violence wrought in Central America by the support of the Contras. But I believe that given the world as he saw it, Bill was seeking to do what was best for the United States.
Casey collapsed, you will recall, from a brain seizure in December. It happened on the day that he was to testify before Congress on the Iran-Contra scandal. On February 2nd, he resigned his post as the nation's top spy.
Before leaving Washington for Long Island, the president recorded his weekly radio address. He used the opportunity to attack some congressmen for proposing cuts in his budget.
First time in history, we seem to be on the verge of major...
Funeral today, a former CIA director, William Casey, out on Long Island. In attendance, President Reagan and other top officials to pay their respects to 74-year-old Casey, who died of complications following brain cancer surgery. Steve Dunlop covered the story.
The list of mourners read like a Republican who's who. President and Mrs. Reagan, former President Nixon, Attorney General Edwin Meese, and William Webster, the man nominated to take over the CIA. Attendance at William Casey's funeral was by invitation only, and there was still an overflow crowd.
I've known Bill Casey practically my whole political life. It's been an inspiration to me, and he's an old friend, colleague.
He's a great, warm human being with a tremendous dedication to his country and a great sense of humor.
But if this political crowd thought politics would be put aside today, they were wrong. From the pulpit at St. Mary's Church, John McGahn, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Long Island and a longtime friend of Casey's, nonetheless criticized the violence in Central America he said had resulted from U.S. aid to the Contras.
Bill must have thought the U.S. bishops blind to the potential of a communist threat in this hemisphere, as we oppose and continue to oppose the violence wrought in Central America by the support of the Contras.
McGann's words were gentle compared to those of a handful of protesters near the church, one of whom carried a sign saying, "Bury him in Nicaragua." They drew flack from most other bystanders who said the placards were inappropriate at a funeral. In the eulogy, former UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick defended Casey's support of the Contras, despite the criticism it cost him in his final days.
He could take the guff required to support unpopular ideas, like the free market, and controversial causes, like the Contras, because he had studied the evidence.
Even in death, it seems, the country's former top spy will have a political impact. His family has asked that in lieu of flowers, donations be sent to the William Casey Memorial Fund for the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. Burial was at Holyrood Cemetery in Westbury, Long Island. Steve Dunlop, Channel 5 News.
Still ahead, there was rioting in Northern Ireland. One was laid to final rest today. President and Mrs. Reagan flew to Long Island to join relatives and friends at the funeral of former CIA Director William Casey. Tight security surrounded the church where an estimated 400 to 500 people gathered. 74-year-old Casey's death Wednesday left many questions about the scandal unanswered. In one eulogy today, former UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick defended Casey's role in the Iran-Contra affair. But in another eulogy, a Catholic bishop criticized U.S. policy in Central America, and he also offered prayers for William Casey.
May God grant to the noble soul of this dedicated citizen and wonderful person eternal rest. May he give the strength to Sophia and to the family in this period of loss, and may we all appreciate the contribution that he made both as a Catholic gentleman and as a servant of our country and of the world.
A final tribute to former CIA Director William Casey. It's still ahead tonight on USA Tonight. The campaign